Welcome to The Thing About Witch Hunts. I'm Josh Hutchinson.
I'm Sarah Jack. Today we're taking you across the Atlantic to Scotland, where a remarkable movement is uncovering one of history's most devastating and concealed injustices.
Between 1563 and 1736, Scotland's witch hunts claimed at least 2,500 lives, 85% of them women. To put that in perspective, Scotland executed about 5 times more people per capita than England, making it one of the deadliest witch hunting regions in all of Europe.
Our guest today is Dr. Margaret Malloch, a criminology professor at the University of Stirling, who has been studying these remembrance campaigns through her project, Memorializing Injustice.
As Margaret will explain, this is about much more than acknowledgement. It's about understanding how historical trauma shapes us today and why confronting injustice, past and present, is essential for any society that claims to value justice.
We think you'll find some striking parallels between what's happening in Scotland and the witch trial remembrance movements here in the United States.
So let's go to our conversation with Margaret Malloch about memorializing injustice.
Welcome to the Thing About Witch Hunts podcast. We are so excited to talk with you today. Please introduce yourself and tell us about your professional background.
Thank you. Well, it's great to be here with you both. I'm Margaret Malloch, and I'm a professor of criminology at the University of Stirling in Scotland, and I'm part of the Scottish Centre for Crime and Justice Research. And I suppose in terms of my background, my interest, I had an ongoing interest in justice, both social and legal, for many years. And really, for the past 30 years, my research and teaching has examined the experiences of women, in particular, as they encounter the sort of criminal legal system, both as victims or survivors of gender-based violence and also as criminalised people. So I'm particularly interested in the ways that punishment's prioritised and the kind of context around that and how we understand justice. So, of course, as part of that, I've also been interested in injustice and how that's a consistent feature of our legal system and how people resist it, which is one of the things I'm particularly interested in. And to that end, I've been involved with a coalition, the Coalition Against Punishment in Scotland, which has attempted to raise some issues around our system and particularly some of the things that the features of our criminal legal system, where we've got the highest prison population in Europe per head of the population, got a terrible record of remanding people in custody and really high levels of deaths in custody and drug and alcohol related deaths. So there's a lot of things to turn our attention to in that capacity. And I suppose the sort of historical and contemporary resonance around my work has kind of connected justice, the law, the state, patriarchy. I've always had an interest in Scottish history. And of course, the Scottish witch hunts are a kind of clear indication of forms of injustice that are part of our legacy. And as to that end, I'm a trustee for an organisation remembering the accused witches of Scotland. So I think for me, I'm always trying to make connections between theory, politics, and activism.
Great. Thank you so much. Your project that got our attention is Memorializing Injustice, and that's through Leverhulme Trust Fellowship. What were your goals when you started that project?
What I was really interested in finding out was to try and learn more about some of the campaigns that were emerging across Scotland to remember those accused under the Witchcraft Act in Scotland, which was in place between 1563 and 1736 predominantly, and which resulted in around at least 4,000 people, 85% of them being women, being accused of witchcraft. And although the figures are unclear, at least 2,500 being executed. And so I was interested in what the wider impacts of the witch hunts and those executions might be, because obviously they would have resonated extensively across Scotland. But it was an area of history that people didn't seem to know very much about. But there had certainly been a significant resurgence in interest in this part of history. And I think really you could trace that for the last maybe 10 years or so. So what I was interested in was, how do these campaigns attempt to take the lives of those people who have often been, concealed, people don't know their names, don't know very much about them, take their lives and try and make them grievable, try and remember them and bring them back into our contemporary world. And as part of that, I was interested in looking at the different forms of memorialization that were taking place and how the stories of those people who had been accused were actually transformed through the work of remembering them. And I was really interested in the fact that there was a lot of creative work going on to try and find appropriate ways to remember these people and their lives. And as part of that, I suppose I was also keen to find out if those campaigns and this memory work actually had an impact on the local communities that they were taking place within, and how some of the fact that these histories have been concealed and were now being brought to the fore was actually shaping people's understanding of justice, the people that were involved in the campaigns and the wider community around that. So for me, the idea of how we understand justice and how the fact that this past, our history, has been concealed and now people are trying to find out more about it, and the fact that these awful injustices happened was part of the sort of the focus of the project. And I was very fortunate that I got funding from the Leverhulme Trust to do a fellowship and look into that in more detail.
When did the campaigns to remember the witch trials begin?
Well, I think that it's a really interesting question that you ask, because I would initially have said probably quite recently. But as I looked into the topic, I became aware that even at the time of the witch hunts, there were people speaking out against them. Not very many, and it was a risky thing to do, but there were. And that's another part of history that I think, as people have been investigating it a little bit further, they've actually found out more of the people who tried to resist it. So I think that's very interesting and important for us to know. And I think it also signifies the fact that there are lots of power dynamics in place when we try to remember, and there's been lots of power dynamics in place about what we forget. So, for me, some of this process of remembering and memorializing actually involves a kind of counter-memory work to challenge some of the official historical narratives that are in place. But across Scotland, the other thing is that there are a number of memorials, not that many considering the number of people who were executed and the extent of the witch hunts that took place. But they've been there for many years. Some of them we're not quite sure when they were put in place. They're often referred to as witches' stones. And some of them simply mark the potential sites of execution of the accused. But others definitely seem to act as memorials to the dead. And one of the most well-known, for example, is the Witch's Well on the Esplanade at Edinburgh Castle, which is where most of the accused were executed. And that dates back to 1894. So there has been an ongoing interest, I suppose, at different points in time. And you could define that as part of the campaigns that I've been interested in. Campaign's a difficult term to use because a lot of the people that I've spoken to would say, I'm not a campaigner, I'm just an ordinary, interested member of the community who wants to right a wrong. So that's, I suppose, one of the things that I've had to kind of take into account with the project. But the more contemporary ones, and I suppose more recently, you could date back to 2004, where we actually saw the pardon of 81 people and their cats under the Barons Court of Preston Grange in Dolphinston in Scotland, where under the sort of some strange Baron Court system that was actually abolished in 2004, that local community was actually able to enact a pardon. So again, there has been work going on for some time. And I think, again, the more contemporary work that's been going on perhaps dates back to the Swiss government's official pardon that was granted to Anna Goldie, who was seen to perhaps the last person executed as a witch in Europe, and she was granted an official pardon. And following that, there was some work done in the UK to lobby the Justice Secretary at the time to get a posthumous pardon for people across the UK. That didn't succeed, but by that point, we did have a Scottish Parliament that had been established in Scotland, and so there were representations to that in 2008, again calling on the Scottish Government to take the necessary action to grant a posthumous pardon to everybody who'd been convicted in Scotland under the witchcraft legislation. But that wasn't successful, but it did generate conversations around monuments and perhaps a memorial. And I think that since then there has been evidence of different examples of memorials that have been set up in different parts of the country, and it perhaps follows on from these conversations that were generated at that point and the sort of things that were happening internationally. So that's a long answer to your question.
Yeah, that's great. It's interesting. We're, speaking of Europe, but some of those states that you mentioned, there was some activity happening in the US and New England because Rebecca Nurse, her monument went up right at the end of the 19th century on her homestead. And then in the early 2000s, there was a gentleman in Connecticut named Tony Grigo who was working, trying to get an exoneration for the accused there. That didn't happen till 2023.
You mentioned remembering the accused witches of Scotland. What can you tell us about that campaign and how did you get involved with that?
So this was a group that was set up in Fife. They've been going for a number of years, and that was one of the areas where there was a high number of people were executed and accused. And it was a small group of people that got together to initially try to find a way to remember the accused witches of Fife. And they set up a conference, and they held their first conference. They've had a number of conferences since then. In 2019, they were called at that point Fife Witches Remembered. And I had gone along to the conference with a friend. I was really interested in what was happening, and it was an opportunity to hear other interested people speaking about the witch hunts. And there was also a lot of discussion there about how we could remember and what might be an appropriate way of taking action to make some reparation of the fact that people didn't know about this history, and how could that be made more public. So at that point, I had gone along, got involved, and they subsequently, because I think there was such an interest in their campaign, it then shifted to being Remembering the Accused Witches of Scotland, and it's a more national focus now. The key aims were to try and obtain an apology from the state and the Church of Scotland for the witch hunts. They have a strong emphasis on education and informing the public, trying to take some of this information into schools, and also to campaign for a national memorial for those accused. So I didn't stay in Fife at the time, but when COVID happened and there was obviously all the lockdowns, they went on to Zoom. And that meant that those of us that didn't stay near Fife were able to get involved in the campaign. And they've been very active ever since. As I say, it's a small group of people, and they do a lot of public information and also research. So they've been involved in going back to some of the archives across the country. And as part of that, as people are doing that, they're discovering more people who were accused or executed whose records have not yet been fully explored.
It's so amazing what a few people are able to do with this concealed history and the persistence. What are some things that the campaigns have in common?
There have been a number of groups that have been active across Scotland with some, to some extent, some are sort of more national. For example, there's the Witches of Scotland as well, who are a group that take a national perspective, and others are much more locally based. They've emerged from their local community, perhaps sometimes with a historical group or heritage group. And so there are slightly different emphases in different places, but there have been a lot of issues in common. And I think that the shared aim across all of them is really to try and educate, inform, and find an appropriate way to memorialise. I think that the sense of injustice that everybody who is involved in this work has, the sort of thing that motivates and prompts them to take things forward. And I think the fact that in many areas people don't know about this part of history is, again, a great motivator in trying to get that information out. I think some of the things that they've got in common is the recognition that this part of history has often been hidden, and so how do we find out more? And I think that resonates with other work that's been going on in the last probably 10 years or so in Scotland again around our kind of history of colonialism and the legacy of slavery, and sort of trying to think about appropriate ways to address and understand that. Despite this growing recognition, we still find that in a lot of local museums and local areas, there's a great deal of information available, but not about this particular part of history. So I think people have taken it upon themselves to try and explore why that might be the case and how they can address that. I think the main thing that drives people is an attempt to challenge some of the kind of stereotypes and misinformation that's been put around about the witch hunts and who were witches and what that means. And so I think a shared approach is to try and highlight the lives of these ordinary people and the fact that this injustice happened to ordinary people. And one of the things that has always struck me in the work that I've been doing is the way that when people get involved, and it's very often in women that are leading these campaigns, they talk about this sort of resonance that they feel with those who've been accused, this sort of shared, I suppose, there's lots of things that they perhaps identify as shared qualities of being a woman and encountering various forms of injustice. But that's, it sometimes goes beyond that for people to feel almost they describe as though they've been haunted by this injustice of the past. And once they understand and cover the facts of the lives of some of the people who've been accused, they want to help make their voices heard. So there's this thing about saying their names and making sure that their names are spoken and that they're reclaimed as ordinary people who were the victims of a grave injustice. So I think that that's very much a feature. And obviously, there's been a lot of conversations and discussions about, well, once we can identify this history and we want to do something about it and address this injustice, then what's an appropriate way to remember and to memorialize? And I mean, that's not without its challenges, I think, because that can take so many different forms. But I think there definitely is an attempt to find appropriate ways to remember and memorialize the past. And as I said, it's taken lots of interest in artistic and creative forms.
Yeah. I was struck when you just said that people have this feeling they're being haunted by the injustice, because we've heard those exact terms used by campaigners we've talked to in the States, that they feel like the women that were accused or the men that were accused are haunting their lives, and that they almost speak to them because that injustice just, it stays with you once you know about it.
Yeah, definitely. And I think when people are campaigning and it's something that they're working on in their local area, and it's, the resonance with the past, it's the same streets and the same places, and sometimes these areas haven't changed a great deal, that people in the local area still have the same names. And there definitely is something about that kind of connection with the past. I like Avery Gordon's work. She talks about how those injustices of the past manifest themselves in the present and they call for action. And I certainly feel that when people are gripped in this way, this is what they want. They want something to be done. And I think it's a really powerful kind of emotional connection that many people describe.
Are there any particular goals of the campaigns that really stand out?
Definitely the work on education has been important, and I think that's ongoing. It's not something that's included in our school curriculum, but I do know that there has been a lot of work done about trying to think about how this might be taken into schools. And I think that in Scotland in particular, there have been calls for an apology. So that was definitely something that was called for, and fortunately that was successful. So in 2022, we had an apology from, at the time, our First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, who apologised on behalf of the state for the wrongs that were done to the accused and those executed. And we also had an apology from the General Assembly of the Church of Scotland, which was a really important, I think, acknowledgement of what happened in the past. There has been quite a lot of work done around an attempt to get a pardon. That's not the goal of all the groups, and that's currently, I think it's stalled at this present point in time. But there has been a lot of work done, which in itself has generated quite a lot of publicity for the campaigns. And as I say, I think across the country where these campaigns have taken, I think that the ways of remembering are the kind of sort of fundamental. How do we remember? How do we find some forum to name those who were accused and executed, and what would be a fitting way to remember them? So there has been some successes in those different directions. As I say, the apology has been met. So that's something that I think has been very successful and a very powerful result of the campaigns. In local areas, quite regularly now, we're seeing new forms of memorialisation being unveiled. So some groups have been successful in installing, for example, information boards, which either in churchyards or in museums or in appropriate places that refer to the events of the past. And I suppose that in itself would generate further work. There's been a lot of public talks that have taken place that seem to be really well attended. This is an area that does seem to generate a lot of interest amongst the general public. And I think one of the other things has been the importance of collaboration. So there have been a lot of different ways of working with other groups. So, for example, working with the church, with artists and local councillors. There's been films, there's a lot of books that have been written, fiction and non-fiction, and work that's gone on collectively to try and raise awareness and highlight this injustice that's been done.
There's a lot of evidence of acknowledgement growing. And when you mentioned the apologies, those are so significant because when leadership says this shouldn't have happened, it's so powerful.
To have those powerful institutions making that acknowledgement, it does have a great deal of power behind it. I don't know what benefit it might have to those who were executed, and that's one of the questions that is often raised in conversations and discussions. But it is, I think, really important, and I'm aware with the work that you've been doing as well globally and the ongoing contemporary nature of witch hunts that continue across the world, that having some kind of formal acknowledgement that we are really sorry that this past happened here, we don't want to see it happening again, is really important.
We have been told by many of the modern advocates against witch hunting that it is significant when Scotland has an apology, when Connecticut has an absolution, that those things resound around the world and improve their chances of making change in their nations.
Hopefully,
Yeah, hopefully. How have the people of Scotland generally reacted to these campaigns?
I think it's definitely generated a lot of interest, and I suppose that it's difficult to say to what extent that's gone beyond people who are perhaps already interested in either injustice, or there has been a lot of interest in, I suppose, all things witch in the last few years as well. Some of that being very kind of commercially orientated, but it certainly has been notable. And I think that, as I say, when there are talks, public talks, anything like that seems to be really well attended. And in many ways, I think that some of the issues that are raised by discussions, conversations, and this sharing of information about our historical past, it does resonate with some contemporary concerns around justice and injustice. And for me, what's really important is the way that it highlights the fact that the law isn't always right or just. And we can see over the last 10 years or so, there have been lots of concerns around justice. Some of that's around gender-based violence, and we've seen the sort of rise of campaigns to try and address that. In the UK, there has been quite a lot of concern around the policing of violence against women and gender in general. And I suppose that's raised questions for people, again, about the role of the state and the sort of wider political system. So I think that having conversations that allow us to explore some of the injustices of the past resonate with some of the concerns that people have today. And I suppose that's one of the things that really interested me was about the extent to which when people found out about this historical past and this historical injustice, so how did that shape their understanding of what was happening in the world today? And in Scotland at the moment, it's quite evident that there has been a lot of political protest around different issues, particularly some of the things that are going on internationally. And we've seen an increasing response to police the protests. And I think that highlights that there are some questions around what we mean by justice in a so-called liberal democracy. When we understand some of the things that went on in the past, I think it helps us to perhaps put that into some perspective as well.
Are the campaigns revealing trauma from the witch hunts?
I think they are, yes. I think just in terms of as I said before, that emotive power that people experience when they find out about them and they consider some of their effects that this might have had on their own community, I think it's something that's not really been discussed. There is some work that I am aware of that's been going on, led by different individuals, perhaps from a more kind of psychotherapeutic background, who have attempted to bring particular forms of healing to those places. And that takes different forms. Sometimes that's done with quite a spiritual approach to try and kind of heal the traumas of the past. But I think that there is a recognition that, especially in Scotland, the fact that this happened across the country to such an extent, and in places it happened several times, so that the witch hunts came and they came back, and they affected large numbers of people in what was a small population. We killed in Scotland about 5 times more people than our neighbours in England, even though we had a smaller population. So the intensity of the witch hunts in Scotland couldn't have failed to have an impact on the people living there at that time. And I think that there's a recognition that the fact that that resulted in people being displaced, people living in fear, it would undoubtedly have had an effect. And what I suppose we don't fully understand is the impact that that's had on successive generations. And I think that it's interesting that for some of that work that's coming and been taking place from that more sort of psychotherapeutic process has been interesting and probably badly needed. We had a real rupture in Scotland about this sort of emphasis on the creation of this godly society. And so the churches had such a lot of power in the way that they were able to enforce the sort of moral and social order that, yeah, there's undoubtedly a legacy from those times.
And concealing the history is an aspect of the trauma.
I would imagine that that was very much the case. It is interesting how recently I've been visiting some small areas in the west coast of Scotland, small towns, which did actually have witch hunts and had people executed. And I know that because some people have written books about them and they have gone to the archives and they're able to tell us about them. And I've visited the museums and I've been so surprised that there's no markers in the town or in those areas to denote this. There's a history that's depicted in the local museums, which has obviously been really painstakingly presented. And it goes right back to the sort of Neolithic times up until the sort of 1990s. And this point in history, some of that just seems to be missing. And I do think that that's interesting. And as I say, it's only really while I've been doing this work and sort of looking at how we memorialise that I would actually have been aware that this part of history is missing. And it's interesting to wonder why that might be the case. But I agree with you, Sarah. I think it was concealed. And I think we also see that in the fact that many of the records are missing or destroyed, perhaps been destroyed, of this period. We were very fortunate that the University of Edinburgh has done a lot of work by creating a survey of Scottish witchcraft, and it's a fantastic resource. It has an interactive map. It can tell you where the trials took place and where people died, but there's lots and lots of gaps. There's nearly 700 people who are unknown. Their names aren't even known because we don't have the records. There are some places where there's just references to a group of witches who were executed, but we don't know how many, we don't know who these people were. And I think that that's also, that's an indication, I think, of perhaps it wasn't that long after the event that people realised that what had happened was an absolute abomination, and so they tried to conceal the evidence. But it's also what motivates the people that are trying to find out about these lives that have been eradicated. And that's the thing that seems to drive so many people to try and find out what happened.
Yeah, it's a lot of your points just really resonate with what we experience over here in the US. People are searching for the stories and to try to grasp, how did this happen? Who did it happen to? And there's such a lack of presentation of the history in museums. It's in a lot of books that are on shelves, but it's not presented widely. And Austin, my question, it probably needs to change a little bit. My question has been, when are you going to include this history? But the real question is, why aren't we?
Mm-hmm.
Why aren't we?
Yeah.
Because if you could answer that correctly, then it's not when, because then you're going to take the steps to get it included. And there isn't an excuse for not presenting it anymore.
Yeah. I certainly think that there's something that seems to have, perhaps there is a momentum at this point in time, I think, in Scotland anyway, to take that forward. And I think that, yeah, people are asking those kinds of questions. And I think also the interesting parallel between the fact that the sort of printing press was one of the things that helped spread the witch hunts, because people had the information about witches and the publication of different tracts that they used. At this point, it's perhaps the fact that we now have access to more archives, the more digital archives, and people are sort of trying to look back into their heritage and tracing their family trees, that there are more resources available to people. And I think that that in itself is also, along with this momentum about this great injustice was done and we don't know about it. So let's, why are we not doing something, and what can we do? And there are now resources, I think, developing all the time to allow us and enable us to do that. So hopefully we'll see some shifts.
And I do love the creativity that is bringing that development. You've mentioned that a few times. There's so many different avenues and creative ways for recognizing and memorializing this history.
Yeah. And I think that speaks to me as well about the emotional resonance that people have, that there has been some amazing work that's been done in terms of poetry, artwork, plays and presentations, all sorts of mediums to try and find ways to express this, what people are feeling, as a way of memorializing and remembering. Yeah, it's very powerful. And I think that in itself serves a function for people to try and generate that energy in a creative direction. Because I think with all injustice, and I think that that's the thing, with all injustice, you can get stuck at the point of not knowing how to deal with it and how do we respond. And it can sometimes feel quite overwhelming. But I think that the way that this has sort of generated collective work around trying to take this forward has been really powerful. It creates a solidarity with the dead, but also with people now living.
Over here in the States, Salem's obviously an exception to the rule because everybody knows about Salem. But the other witch trials in Massachusetts and the ones in Connecticut, like nobody knows about. And it's only been changing in the last few years. 20 years ago, the movement to exonerate the Connecticut accused started, but that took 18 years to get passed because nobody knew that Connecticut had witch trials, even the people of Connecticut. It had been suppressed so well. There were late 19th century writers who were writing that Connecticut didn't have witch trials at all. And we now know that at least 11 people were executed and dozens more were accused. So this whole concealing of memory thing really struck me when you were talking about that. And we're just now starting to see people grasp that Connecticut had its own witch trials and Boston had its own witch trials outside of Salem. How have these campaigns, have they had an impact on citizen understanding of witch trial history in Scotland?
Yeah, yes, I definitely think that they are. And we're also affected by, I think it's also been interesting in Scotland to see what's happening elsewhere and to find out the fact that there's something in the fact that this is a shared experience that's really important, even though we were at the kind of high end of the hunts over here. But yes, I think that it does. I think that there are, it's difficult to get a sense of the extent to which the general public has kind of engaged with some of this. There has, as I say, there's been a lot of interest. Some of it maybe is from people who would be interested in these kinds of issues anyway. It's not been without contention because, I think that, for instance, one of the campaigns across the UK to try and petition for a pardon, the issue was about, I suppose the dissent was, what's the relevance for that today? But I think when you make the case that there is quite clearly relevance for today, then people do seem to understand that. I think that the concealed history, I think it does have an impact on how people understand who they are and who are we today. I think that's one of the things we can say about Scotland. We have very sometimes stereotyped views about Scottish exceptionalism and the fact that we think that we have a particular international sort of outlook and approach. And I think that situations like the fact that the witch hunts were so high in Scotland, the numbers executed were so high, that we still have an incredibly punitive criminal legal system, do raise questions.
There's so much I'm finding in common that you're mentioning in Scotland with what we're experiencing in the States. There's that punitive nature to the States. Our incarceration rate is sky high, and that American exceptionalism still governs a lot of how our leaders behave. And there's a movement underfoot here to stop teaching a lot of the more negative aspects of American history and focus on the positive aspects and presenting the country in the best light.
I'd be interested in asking you, Josh. So I'm aware that there'll be some challenges ahead for you in that respect. And how do you see that you might be able to resist that?
Just the more we can talk, the more we can get these victims' names out there and their stories and help people understand the injustice of the witch trials and how that relates to the injustices we're seeing today. I think it's very important not to be silent right now about aspects of our history that might not be the most positive, but they're the ones that we learn the most from. at least in my opinion, or negative history has so much to teach us about human nature, human behavior, how people respond in times of great fear and uncertainty. So I think just, podcasting, having live video events that people can attend and learn about witch trials, writing about it, blogging about it, just shouting from the mountaintops, hey, this has happened before. What we're seeing now, we can actually step in and stop some of this.
Yeah, I would add too that your project name, Memorializing Injustice, that says so much there. And Josh mentioned the injustice just now, and we've been talking about this injustice. And I think there's still so much stigma around, was it unjust? What is justice? Who deserves justice? We have to face that there is injustice in this world that is still being perpetrated right in front of us. And we don't want to have to be memorializing that in 100 years, but we are going to be. So I think the more that we discuss injustice, and I think cultural criminology is something that we need to understand more. And we need to look at how do we apply criminology to witch hunts and to injustices. So your work is really important. Our podcast exists because of the multitude of people facing the situation, whether they have researched it and are talking about what happened, or they're on the ground now trying to find justice for modern survivors and victims. So we just all need to keep kicking up the dirt.
Yeah. I certainly think your podcast does have a big impact. And just to plug it as well, I was listening to your summary of your 100 episodes, and I thought that was so powerful in identifying the themes that you've had been speaking to people about over your previous episodes, and the fact that though they all spoke about things that we need to think about today. So yeah, I definitely encourage people to go and listen back to that as well.
Yeah, thank you. There's a quote that I read in an article about your project. You said restitution for historical injustice is essential for an effective justice system. Can you explain what you meant by that?
I suppose for me, that was one of the sort of reflections that I had as I began it. And I'm always very dubious and cynical about the fact that the system can put right the wrongs of the past. And I think, as you mentioned, we don't want to be in a situation where that's the case because the people who they directly affected are gone. But there's something about being able to acknowledge when things are not right and when things are unjust. And I think that there is something about if the system claims to be just, it has to be able to accept that if there has been something that has gone wrong. And I think that in the UK, we've had a number of large public scandals around particular things that have gone very wrong. And it's taken people a long time to get any recognition that that was the case. And so I think for me, it's that acknowledgement and then an attempt to put right by dealing with the contemporary situation that's important. And I think that that's where the idea of some form of restitution is crucial. We're dealing with systems that make a lot of claims, have a lot of power. And I think that's the other issue. It's the sort of power that is held by the state in the past has been held by the church. That's maybe it's slightly different today. But our enforcement agencies still retain a huge amount of power and authority. And so they can't assume that when things go wrong, it's acceptable to cover it up or to conceal it.
Thank you for this wonderful conversation today.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak with you and to be part of this. And as I said, I think that your podcast is a really powerful resource, and it's been so good to hear about some of the work that you've done in the States to address some of those issues that we've been talking about. And I suppose that I try to take a positive out of this, that while we are dealing with something that's a really difficult issue, it talks about a very dark past. The fact that in some ways people are coming together in solidarity and trying to take collective action to do something good for their communities is what makes it worthwhile. And I suppose there's something important to hang on to.
Thank you so very much. It's been a real honor to have you
you.
here. So thank you.
So I was sitting at my kitchen table today drinking coffee just like this. And the mailman rang the door. I wasn't the person to jump up and go to the door, but someone in my household signed for an international package.
International.
And I'm like, well, we know who that's for, but I was so puzzled. I'm like, what book am I getting? Because usually it's a book for a podcast episode or researching.
Yeah.
And then I read Claire Campbell, and I knew that was designer of the Witches of Scotland tartan. So that is what's in here.
From their episode.
That is what is in here. Our organization's tartan piece. It's right here. And I'm so excited. I'm so excited to be a part of this memorialization through a tartan and to have it. And I haven't looked at it yet. We're going to look at it here. What do you think? Are you excited?
I'm so excited. I'm glad that you brought me in on this to watch the unboxing.
Here we go.
Da-da-da-da.
Da-da-da-da. I have to be careful because I have to keep this packaging forever.
Oh, yeah.
It's a memento, too. All right. Here we go.
Is it there? Oh, it's in a special fancy
It
envelope with their
is.
logo on it.
Yeah, I'm just going to pick up this little card that fell.
Yeah, their little card. That's the logo I saw.
I'm so
Little pink
excited.
bow. W for Witches of Scotland.
Wow. How wonderful.
And is that a prickly thistle?
Yes.
Yeah.
Which is a manufacturer company.
That's the once you make the tartans.
Claire, and Zoe, thank you. Oh, this is so awesome.
Oh, I caught a glimpse. What,
Oh, it's so
what
soft.
does it actually look like?
It is amazing.
Yay.
It is amazing.
I like it a lot.
Oops, I dropped the pen.
Oh.
Oh, it's beautiful. It is beautiful.
Yeah. You're gonna wear that?
I am.
Yes.
Yay.
Perfect for your chilly Colorado winters.
Yeah, today's kind of chilly. It is only like 77 degrees today, but
Yeah, chilly for the summer.
yeah. No, I'm actually gonna, one of the great things about getting your piece from them is you can do what you want with it. And we're all going to share a little bit of this in our organization. Our board members are going to have a piece of this to share. So
Yay.
we really love Claire and Zoe and Witches of Scotland. Their podcast has been a huge inspiration to our work, especially in 2023 when we were working on the exoneration of those accused of witchcraft in Connecticut.
Yeah, their whole campaign has been inspiration. It was one of the drivers in us starting the podcast was that they were using their podcast to promote the pardon and apology and memorial for the Scottish accused of witchcraft. And we're doing the same thing in Connecticut. So we thought, hey, let's podcast.
Yeah. Plus they really illustrated to us that we could highlight the advocates around the world who are addressing the modern crisis of witchcraft accusations. They have featured Leo Igwe, and that led us to our work of interviewing advocates around the world on our podcast, which is right now called The Thing About Witch Hunts. Previously, it was Witch Hunt Podcast.
Listening to Leo on the Witches of Scotland podcast really got us interested, got him on our radar, and he's such an amazing person. So very grateful to have that connection because of Witches of Scotland basically introducing us, even though they didn't know it.
Yeah. Everyone probably has listened to him on Witches of Scotland podcast, but check those episodes out. Also check out our episodes interviewing Leo on the Thing About Witch Hunts podcast.
Yeah. And one of the great thrills we had last year was to do a cross episode with the Witches of Scotland. So Claire and Zoe joined us and we released the same episode on our podcast and that they did on their podcast. And that was fabulous.
Yeah. Theirs is titled Connecticut Witch Trials, and ours is titled Witch Hunt X Witches of Scotland.
Yeah.
So the other cool thing that's coming up for the Witches of Scotland is their new book that is out in the UK and coming out in September. How to Kill a Witch, a Guide for the Patriarchy. It's coming out September 30th.
I'm excited to read that too.
Me too.
I've already pre-ordered my copy.
Yeah, so you can also pre-order one in our bookshop. It supports our nonprofit End Witch Hunts, and that link is bookshop.org/shop/End Witch Hunts, and our nonprofit is endwitchhunts.org.
I'm going to read from the Scottish Register of Tartans, the Witches of Scotland tartan description here. It says, this design was created to memorialize those who suffered as a result of the Witchcraft Act 1563 to 1736 in Scotland. This tartan will be woven to make products to help create a living memorial. So this basically is the realization of getting a memorial to the witches. It's one that we can all wear and share, and people around the world can see this memorial without having to travel.
Yeah, memorials are extremely important. That's the beautiful thing about memorials. There's lots of ways to memorialize, and this is so significant. So thank you, Zoe and Claire, and for whoever worked on this and had this phenomenal idea to remember those victims this way. Want more Scottish witch trial history and conversation? We have several other lovely episodes with special experts on the Scottish witch trials. Go check them out now.
Have a great today and a beautiful tomorrow.